The great storms had finally passed, but the sky above the mud had turned entirely dead. The swollen rivers of the young world ran heavy and wild, carving deep, jagged ravines into the stone. The deep roots of the earth drank until the dirt turned to thick, freezing clay. The drought was broken. The great serpent was dead, but the violence of the flood had driven the gods away. Looking down at the ruined, fragile earth, the gods realized their sheer presence was too heavy for it to bear. Indra's weapon had saved the dirt, but the sheer noise of heaven was a fatal threat to anything that grew. They withdrew into the unreachable heights, ascending far above the cloud line, and locked the heavy doors of heaven behind them. The humans were left behind in the cold, ankle-deep in the wet soil, shivering under the massive, dripping canopy of the flooded forests. The survivors looked up at a vast, empty distance. There was no terror of the great serpent anymore. There was only absolute silence, a crushing, physical isolation. If a hunter slipped and broke his spine on the wet rocks, no god saw it. If a woman cried out in the long, freezing nights, the biting wind swallowed her voice long before it could cross the distance to the high halls. The sky had turned entirely deaf. Slowly, the shadows of the mountains stretched long and dark across the valleys. The standing water began to freeze. The wind shifted, carrying a lethal, creeping frost that hardened the mud into iron. Staring up into the deafening void, the shivering camps understood. If they wanted to speak to the sky, human throats were completely useless. The distance was impassable. They needed a messenger. They needed something born in the mud, but desperate to climb. Torn hands searched the damp earth. The survivors dug through the freezing clay, finding nothing but wet stone and rotting, waterlogged pine. As the freezing dark pressed closer, threatening to bury the camp silently in the frost, a single, desperate human found a piece of hard, dry wood sheltered beneath a collapsed stone. Placing a sharp stick against the grain, trembling fingers began to spin the wood between blistered palms. The friction was brutal and relentless. Torn skin bled onto the bark. Muscle tore against the repetitive motion, forcing heat into the dead branch, grinding fiber against fiber in the suffocating cold. And then, a tiny glowing red seed fell into a handful of dry grass. It was the first spark. Breath caught in the freezing air. Faces leaned down, blowing softly onto the red seed. The grass curled, blackened, and suddenly hissed. A tongue of bright yellow heat snapped upward, illuminating the terrified, exhausted faces of the survivors. The freezing grip of the wind broke. A deep, radiating heat pushed the freezing dark away. The humans huddled around the light, feeling the warmth sink into their shivering, numb bones. The ache in their joints began to fade. Breath left their lungs in a heavy cloud. Torn hands had forced the dead wood to yield a tool for survival. The humans were the masters of this small, bright, captive thing. They were entirely wrong. Thicker branches were piled onto the flame. Suddenly, the warmth began to change. The heat did not act like dead stone or passive water. It moved with deep, frantic intention. Yellow flames gripped the thick pine. The heavy bark cracked open with a sharp, violent sound like snapping bones. It did not just burn, it hunted. The flame roared, growing meters high, throwing blinding, violent light against the tree line. The gentle warmth became a physical, suffocating pressure, driving the shivering humans backward into the cold shadows. Lashing out, the fire devoured the dry grass at the edge of the camp, turning everything it touched into fine, white powder. This was not a tame thing born to serve a shivering animal. It was a predator, waking up. While the other gods had fled to the unreachable heights, one had hidden. He had buried himself inside the dry wood, waiting in the absolute dark for human hands to bleed and tear him loose. This was Agni. He was the god who lived in the dirt, and he was starving. The camp scattered. The flame was spreading, tasting the dry edges of the forest, preparing to consume the wet world the humans had just inherited. Torn hands dug frantically into the freezing mud. Heavy clumps of wet earth and packed ice were hurled directly into the roaring center of the heat, desperate to smother the beast that had just been unleashed. But the fire fought back. It hissed violently, swallowing the wet earth and spitting it out as cracked, baked clay. When thick green branches were swung to beat the flames down, the fire climbed up the wood and blistered the skin of the arms holding them. The heat climbed higher, feeding on the very air, refusing to be pushed back down into the dark. Knees hit the freezing dirt. Blistered faces shielded their eyes from the radiant heat. Human hands had not invented a tool. They had released a god. Wild, untamed flames spiraled upward. Agni did not crawl along the ground like a beast. He threw himself violently against the crushing weight of the sky. And then, the smoke changed. It was not a shapeless cloud blowing aimlessly in the mountain wind. The smoke gathered into a thick, rigid, suffocating pillar. It rose in an unbroken vertical line, cutting straight through the freezing air like a black spear. It climbed with terrible, unnatural speed, rejecting the earth entirely. The black pillar did not stop until it slammed directly into the closed doors of heaven. High above, the silent gods stirred. Through the locked gates of the sky, they smelled the sharp, bitter scent of burning pine. They felt the violent heat of the lower world pressing against their pristine halls. Below, in the dirt, the fight against the flames stopped instantly. The humans backed away, staring up at the rigid black line connecting the mud to the divine. The fire was looking at the camp, but it was speaking to heaven. The breath left their lungs. They froze in place. Mud and sticks had just been thrown at a god. Worse, the blinding heat had drawn the attention of the very beings who had locked the sky to avoid destroying the earth. The humans waited in the blinding light, fully expecting the clouds to tear open. Eyes squeezed shut, shoulders braced for the lightning. Every heartbeat expected heaven to hurl a curse down the smoke pillar and erase the camp for its insolence. But no curse came. No lightning fell. The sky remained intact, trapped between the creeping frost at their backs and the blinding fire at their fronts. A single human understood the mechanism. Stepping to the edge of the roaring flame, the survivor didn't fight the heat. Words were spoken into the roar, a plea for mercy, a desperate request for the gods to remember the freezing dirt. The words were shouted into the center of the fire, hoping the rising smoke would carry the human voice into the high halls. The fire crackled, loud and indifferent. The smoke remained empty. The gods did not answer. Agni was a messenger, but he would not carry empty air. He was a mouth, and a mouth demands substance. Waiting for a voice from the sky that never came, the freezing humans stared into the flames. The reality of the new world finally broke them. Heaven was no longer a parent that would protect them simply because they were small and cold. Heaven was a merchant, and it traded only in ash. The gods would only listen if the trade cost the humans something real. Faces turned away from the fire, looking toward the edges of the camp. Small, precious piles of grain sat salvaged from the mud. Heavy, clarified butter sat in clay pots. The thick winter fat desperately needed to survive the coming snow. To keep the sky awake, the dirt would have to bleed its own harvests. To communicate with heaven, the humans had to destroy the exact things that kept them alive. To burn the winter fat was a death sentence. To keep it was a different kind of death. This specific grain was meant for the deep frost. The butter was meant to keep children's bodies warm when the heavy snow fell. A human stepped forward, blistered hands trembling. The skin on their face pulled tight from the intense, blistering heat of the fire, while the biting frost numbed their spine. Reaching into the winter rations, the human took a heavy handful of precious golden grain and a thick measure of butter. Eyes closed tightly. The survival of the kin was thrown directly into the white-hot center of the fire. Agni roared. The flames hissed violently, swallowing the offering in a fraction of a second. The grain blackened into dust. The fat melted and flared into blinding, towering light. The smoke changed instantly. It was no longer the bitter scent of dry pine. It grew thicker, heavier, carrying the sweet, rich essence of the destroyed food straight up the rigid black pillar. The heavy, ruined essence of the harvest struck the gates. This time the gods tasted it. A heavy, unseen presence settled over the clearing. The terrifying silence of the sky broke. The sacrifice had been received. Bodies fell to the dirt, weeping in the intense heat. The universe was bridged. The gods were forced to look down. But as the survivors stared into the glowing embers, watching their winter rations turn to gray dust, the cruel reality of the trade settled into their bones. A trap had just been built. This was the birth of the altar. The fire was now the permanent priest. He was the only bridge. And he would never, ever stop being hungry. The humans were no longer just survivors walking the mud. They were bound to a relentless, eternal cycle of feeding the flame. Year after year, until the end of the world, they would have to burn their own survival to ensure the gods did not forget them. The earth had its messenger, but the price of his voice was ash. And while the gods were satisfied with the sweet smoke of grain and butter for now, smoke is a fragile thing. Soon the high heaven would hunger for something heavier. They would need a power that could not be burned. They would need the drink. If you want to see what happens when the gods learn how to swallow power itself, stay with Mythkipedia.